her 20th anniversary year feels like a good time to remember, all the good things.
Lied and used fake documents to obtain the interview with my mother. Made lurid and false claims about the royal family, which played on her fears and fueled paranoia.
2 princes, 1 envelope. A DNA bombshell that changes everything. When William and Harry tore open identical packages, they had no idea their entire world was about to collapse. The laboratory report inside revealed Diana's most devastating secret, hidden for over 30 years. But nothing could prepare them for what came next. A single photograph slipped from the pages, showing a face that looked impossibly familiar. The relationship between Prince William and Prince Harry has been the subject of intense public scrutiny for years, particularly following the events that unfolded after Harry's departure from royal duties. While many assumed the rift between the brothers stemmed purely from differences in their approach to royal life and media attention, recent reports suggest there may be far more to the story than previously understood. According to sources close to the royal family, both princes were confronted with information that fundamentally challenged their understanding of their own family history, information that arrived without warning and left both men struggling to process its implications. The delivery of this information reportedly happened in a manner that seemed almost calculated in its simplicity. There were no formal meetings, no prepared statements, just correspondence that arrived separately to both brothers at different locations. William was said to be at one of his residences in London when he received the package, while Harry was abroad at the time. The timing of these simultaneous deliveries has raised questions about who orchestrated the revelation and what their ultimate purpose might have been. Inside each package was documentation that appeared to originate from a medical facility. The papers bore the markings and formatting typical of laboratory reports from the late 1980s, a period that coincides with a particularly turbulent time in Princess Diana's life. During those years, Diana was navigating the challenges of a failing marriage while simultaneously dealing with intense media scrutiny and the rigid expectations of royal protocol. She was also known to have made several private trips abroad, some of which were documented only sparingly in official records. The documentation presented to William and Harry contained genetic testing results. While the specific details of these results have not been made public, sources familiar with the matter indicate that the findings suggested a biological connection between Diana and an individual who had not been previously acknowledged as part of the royal family. The implications of such a connection, if verified, would be significant, not only on a personal level for the princes, but also for the institution of the monarchy itself. What made the revelation particularly jarring was the inclusion of photographic evidence alongside the laboratory documents. The photograph showed a young child, and the image appeared to have been handled frequently over the years, with worn edges suggesting it had been kept and viewed many times. For both William and Harry, seeing this photograph reportedly triggered an immediate emotional response. Here was a face they had never seen before, yet one that seemed to carry traces of familiarity that were impossible to ignore. The reaction from both princes, though occurring in separate locations, shared common elements of shock and disbelief. William, known for his measured and controlled public demeanor, reportedly needed time to process what he was seeing. Those who know him well have described him as someone who carefully considers the broader implications of any situation before responding. In this case, the broader implications were enormous. Questions of lineage, succession, and the stability of the monarchy would all potentially come into play, depending on what these documents actually represented. Harry's response was reportedly more immediate and visceral. Having already been in a place of emotional vulnerability due to his own complicated relationship with royal life and the ongoing tensions with his family, the arrival of this information hit him particularly hard. Friends of Harry have suggested that he saw the revelation not primarily as a constitutional issue, but as something deeply personal, another hidden chapter in his mother's life that he was only now discovering years after her death. The timing of this revelation is worth noting. It came during a period when both brothers were already dealing with significant challenges in their relationship. The public nature of Harry's criticisms of the royal family, combined with William's position as future king and his perceived duty to protect the institution, had created a distance between them that many observers believed might never be fully bridged. The arrival of this new information appeared to complicate an already difficult situation even further. What makes this situation particularly complex is the question of verification. DNA testing technology has advanced considerably since the late 1980s, and modern testing protocols are far more rigorous than those that existed decades ago. The documents presented to the princes would need to be authenticated not only in terms of their origin, but also in terms of the scientific validity of any results they claim to show. This process of verification would require access to original samples, chain of custody documentation, and independent laboratory analysis, none of which could happen quickly or quietly. The existence of such documentation also raises uncomfortable questions about what else might have been kept hidden over the years. Diana's life was subject to constant observation and documentation, yet there were clearly aspects of her experience that remained private or were actively concealed. The late 1980s were a particularly difficult period for her, marked by the breakdown of her marriage, struggles with mental health, and increasing isolation within the royal system. If she had indeed been protecting a secret during this time, it would have added another layer of pressure to an already overwhelming situation. For William and Harry, the personal dimension of this revelation cannot be overstated. Both men have spoken publicly about the impact of losing their mother at such young ages and the ongoing process of understanding who she was beyond the public image. Diana died in 1997 when William was 15 and Harry was 12, ages when they were old enough to have memories and impressions of their mother, but still too young to fully understand the complexities of her life. Any new information about Diana, particularly information suggesting she had protected someone or something throughout her life, would naturally prompt both men to reconsider what they thought they knew. The photograph included with the documents added a human element that pure data could never convey. Looking at an image of a child, possibly from the same era when they themselves were young, would force both princes to imagine an alternate reality, a version of their family history that included another person entirely. The emotional weight of such a realization, coming on top of years of grief, tension, and public scrutiny, would be difficult for anyone to bear. As both princes sat with this information in their separate locations, they faced an immediate decision about what to do next. The documents could be dismissed as fabrications, elaborate attempts to destabilize the royal family or extract money through blackmail. Alternatively, they could be treated as credible claims requiring serious investigation. Either path forward would demand careful consideration of the consequences, not just for themselves but for everyone involved. The moment William and Harry began to grasp the potential significance of what they had received, the situation inevitably expanded beyond their private reactions. In matters involving the royal family, particularly those with potential constitutional implications, there exists a well-established network of advisors, legal experts, and institutional guardians whose role is to protect both the individuals involved and the monarchy itself. Within hours of the princes examining the documents, this machinery began to activate. Senior advisors were quietly summoned to discuss the matter. These were not public meetings announced in court circulars or palace schedules. Instead, they took place in private rooms away from the usual flow of palace business, conducted with the kind of discretion that the royal household has perfected over centuries. The individuals brought into these early discussions were chosen for their expertise in legal matters, historical precedent, and crisis management. Each understood that whatever they were about to review could potentially reshape fundamental assumptions about the royal family. The documents were laid out for examination under conditions that resembled a forensic investigation more than a family discussion. The laboratory report, with its clinical language and dated formatting, was studied carefully. Experts noted the header, the terminology used, and the structure of the information presented. These details would be crucial in determining whether the document was authentic or had been fabricated to create exactly the kind of disruption it was now causing. The photograph received similar scrutiny, with questions raised about when it was taken, how it had been preserved, and whether modern image analysis could reveal anything about its origins. What emerged from these initial reviews was both troubling and incomplete. The documents appeared to reference medical facilities and procedures that were known to have existed during the relevant time period. Diana's movements during the late 1980s, while not comprehensively documented in public records, did include periods when she travelled for what were described as private health matters. Swiss clinics, in particular, were known to offer services to wealthy and prominent individuals who valued discretion above all else. The alignment between the document's claims and the known timeline of Diana's life lent a degree of plausibility that made outright dismissal difficult. However, gaps in the documentation were immediately apparent. Medical records from that era, particularly those involving sensitive matters, were often maintained with varying degrees of completeness. Privacy laws and professional standards meant that certain details might have been recorded in ways that protected patient confidentiality, sometimes at the expense of creating a clear historical record. In Diana's case, there were known instances where her medical information had been handled with exceptional care, kept separate from routine royal medical files, and accessed only by a limited number of individuals. The advisors began constructing a timeline attempting to match the dates referenced in the laboratory report with known events in Diana's life. They cross-referenced these with palace schedules, media coverage from the period, and any available personal correspondence. What they found was a pattern of absences and private appointments that had never been fully explained in official records. Some of these gaps had been noted before, but were generally attributed to Diana's need for privacy during a difficult period in her marriage. Now, however, they took on new significance. It was during this process that an unexpected element entered the investigation. Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, requested a private meeting with both William and Harry. Anne has long been known for her straightforward approach and her deep sense of duty to the monarchy. Unlike some members of the royal family who navigate difficult situations through carefully worded statements and diplomatic silence, Anne tends toward directness when she believes it serves a necessary purpose. What Anne revealed in that meeting added a crucial piece to the puzzle. She explained that years earlier, she had received similar documentation. An envelope had been delivered to her through informal channels, not through official palace mail systems. Inside was material that closely resembled what William and Harry had now received. The laboratory report, though possibly a different copy or version, contained the same essential information. There was also a photograph showing the same child from what appeared to be the same time period. Anne's decision to keep this information to herself had not been made lightly. She described the context of that time, a period when the royal family was already dealing with multiple crises. The marriage between Charles and Diana was collapsing in an increasingly public manner. Media scrutiny was at levels that felt unprecedented. There were concerns about the stability of the monarchy itself, with Republican sentiment growing in some quarters. Anne had concluded that introducing another potentially explosive element into this volatile situation could cause damage that might be irreparable. Her reasoning, as she explained it, was rooted in a calculation about harm and benefit. If the information was false, revealing it would create a scandal based on lies and potentially hurt innocent people. If it was true, revealing it would still create a scandal, but one with profound implications for the institution she had spent her life serving. In either scenario, Anne saw limited upside and enormous risk. She also considered the wishes that Diana might have had, assuming the information was accurate. If Diana had chosen to keep this matter private during her lifetime, Anne questioned whether she had the right to make it public after Diana's death. For William and Harry, Anne's admission was difficult to process. On one hand, they could understand the institutional logic that had guided her decision. On the other hand, learning that someone in us, their family had known about this for years and said nothing felt like another layer of betrayal. The information concerned their mother and by extension themselves, yet it had been withheld from them under the assumption that they were better off not knowing. The revelation from Anne also changed the nature of the investigation. Her earlier receipt of similar documents suggested this was not a one-time attempt to destabilize the royal family, but rather something that had been percolating for years. Someone, or perhaps multiple people, had possessed this information and had made decisions about when and how to reveal it. The question of motive became increasingly important. Was this an attempt at extortion, a genuine effort to bring truth to light, or something else entirely? William's response to all of this was characterized by those close to him as deeply conflicted. His entire life had been shaped by preparation for eventual kingship. He understood the monarchy as an institution that depended on stability, continuity, and public confidence. Revelations that called into question the clarity of royal lineage struck at the heart of what the institution represented. At the same time, William had his own memories of his mother, his own sense of what she had endured, and his own feelings about the secrets that had surrounded her life and death. Harry's reaction was reportedly more straightforward, though no less painful. He saw the situation primarily through the lens of his mother's experience and the system that had controlled and constrained her. In his view, Diana had been failed by the institution repeatedly during her life. If she had been carrying a secret that the palace then chose to suppress even after her death, it represented yet another example of the monarchy prioritizing its own preservation over human considerations. Harry's recent experiences had already led him to question the value of institutional loyalty when it came at such personal cost. Thus, tension between the brothers, already strained by their different life choices and public statements, now had another dimension. They were being asked to make decisions together about information that affected them both, but their fundamental orientations toward the monarchy and its obligations were increasingly divergent. William felt the weight of future responsibility and the need to protect an institution that millions of people still invested with meaning and importance. Harry felt the weight of past pain and a conviction that truth, however disruptive, was ultimately more valuable than carefully maintained appearances. As the investigation continued, both brothers knew they were approaching decisions that could not be easily undone. The question was no longer just about verifying the authenticity of documents or determining historical facts. It was about choosing between competing values, between institutional stability and personal truth, between protecting a carefully uttered, constructed narrative and acknowledging a reality that challenged fundamental assumptions about their family. With Princess Anne's confirmation that similar documentation had surfaced years earlier, the investigation took on a new urgency and direction. The brothers and their small circle of trusted advisors recognized that understanding the full scope of what had happened would require more than examining documents. They needed to trace the origins of these claims back through the institutional memory of the palace itself, through the records that had been kept, altered, or potentially destroyed over the decades since Diana's death. The process of accessing historical palace records is more complicated than most people might imagine. The royal household maintains extensive archives, but not everything is stored in one central location, and not everything is equally accessible even to members of the royal family. Some records are considered personal papers of individual family members and are kept separate from official institutional files. Others are held by various government departments, particularly those relating to matters of state or constitutional significance. Still others exist in private collections held by former staff members, advisors, or associates who kept copies of correspondence and documents from their time in royal service. The search began with medical records, specifically those relating to Diana's healthcare during the period in question. What the investigators found was a pattern of incomplete documentation that seemed unusual even by the standards of royal privacy. Standard medical files from that era showed routine appointments and minor treatments, but there were gaps corresponding to the times when Diana was known to have travelled abroad for private medical consultations. Cross-referencing these gaps with travel records and security logs revealed that Diana had indeed made several trips to Switzerland during late 1987 and early 1988, accompanied by minimal security detail and with very little advance notice given to palace staff. The Swiss clinic referenced in the laboratory documents did exist and had a reputation during that period for serving high-profile international clients who required absolute discretion. The facility had since closed and many of its records had been destroyed in accordance with standard data retention policies. However, investigators were able to confirm that the clinic had employed specialists in several fields during the relevant time period and that it had maintained a policy of creating dual record systems, one for routine administrative purposes and another, more detailed set of files that were kept separately and accessed only under specific circumstances. Attempting to verify the authenticity of the DNA report proved challenging for multiple reasons. The science of genetic testing in the late 1980s was far less advanced than it is today. The techniques available at that time were reliable for basic paternity testing and some medical diagnostics, but they lacked the precision and comprehensive nature of modern DNA analysis. This meant that even if the report was genuine, it might not meet current standards for conclusive proof. Additionally, without access to the original biological samples, which almost certainly no longer existed after more than 3 decades, independent verification would be impossible. What investigators could examine were the procedural and documentary elements of the report itself. Forensic document examiners studied the paper, ink, and printing methods used to create the report. They compared the formatting and terminology with other laboratory documents from the same era. They analyzed the signatures and institutional markings to determine whether they were consistent with legitimate medical documentation from that time period. While this analysis could not confirm that the scientific findings in the report were accurate, it could potentially reveal whether the document itself was a modern fabrication designed to look old. The results of this technical analysis were inconclusive but suggestive. The document showed characteristics consistent with genuine materials from the late 1980s, but it was not possible to rule out the possibility of sophisticated forgery. Modern technology makes it feasible to recreate period-appropriate documents with remarkable accuracy, particularly if the forger has access to genuine examples to study and replicate. What the examiners could say was that if the document was a fake, it was an exceptionally well-crafted one that would have required significant resources and expertise to produce. As the documentary investigation continued, William and Harry made the decision to speak directly with individuals who had been close to Diana during the relevant period and who had remained in positions of influence within or around the royal household. These conversations were arranged privately and conducted with the understanding that they were not formal interviews, but rather attempts to gather information that might not exist in any written record. The first of these conversations took place with a former senior palace official who had held considerable authority during the late 1980s and throughout the 1990s. This individual had been involved in managing many of the sensitive situations that arose during the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage. He had been present for difficult decisions about media strategy, security arrangements, and the coordination between the palace and various government offices. If anyone outside the immediate royal family might have known about unusual circumstances surrounding Diana's private life during that period, it would likely have been someone in his position. The conversation was uncomfortable from the beginning. The former official, now elderly but still sharp in his recollections, was clearly reluctant to discuss matters he had first spent decades treating as confidential. He spoke carefully, weighing each word before saying it, and frequently qualified his statements with reminders about the context of the times and the competing pressures that influenced decision-making. When pressed about whether he had any knowledge of Diana carrying a secret related to her personal life during the late 1980s, he did not deny it outright, but instead described a general atmosphere of concern about various matters that could have caused difficulties for the monarchy if they had become public. He explained that during that period, the palace was dealing with multiple challenges simultaneously. The relationship between Charles and Diana was deteriorating in ways that were becoming harder to conceal from the public. There were concerns about Diana's mental health and her ability to cope with the pressures of royal life. Media interest in the royal family was intense and often intrusive. In this environment, palace officials were constantly making judgments about what information needed to be managed carefully and what could be handled through normal channels. When asked directly whether he had been aware of documentation suggesting Diana had a biological connection to a child outside of William and Harry, the former official paused for a long time before responding. He acknowledged that there had been discussions about sensitive medical matters related to Diana, discussions that involved very few people and were conducted with exceptional secrecy. He described these discussions as being framed around protecting Diana's privacy and preventing information that could be misunderstood or misused from entering the public domain. He insisted that the motivations had been protective rather than malicious, aimed at shielding Diana from additional scrutiny rather than concealing wrongdoing. However, he also admitted that the palace's approach to managing information during that era often prioritized institutional concerns over individual welfare. There was an assumption that what was good for the monarchy was ultimately good for the people who comprised the royal family, and that maintaining public confidence in the institution justified considerable efforts to control narratives and limit disclosure of potentially damaging information. Looking back from the perspective of several decades later, he acknowledged that this approach had sometimes caused harm even when the intentions were meant to be protective. William listened to these explanations with visible frustration. He understood the institutional logic being described, and in some ways he even sympathized with the difficult position palace officials had been in. But he also saw clearly how this approach had contributed to his mother's isolation and suffering. The very mechanisms that were supposed to protect her had often made her feel trapped and powerless. Now it appeared that those same mechanisms might have been used to conceal something fundamental about her life, something that affected not just her, but also her sons. Harry's reaction was more pointed. He challenged the former official directly about the ethics of hiding information from the people most directly affected by it. He questioned whether anyone had considered that William and he might have a right to know about aspects of their mother's life, particularly after her death when the justifications about protecting her privacy no longer applied. He asked whether the former official believed that institutional loyalty should always take precedence over transparency and truth, especially when dealing with matters that touched on people's understanding of their own family history. A second conversation took place with a woman who had moved in social circles close to the royal family during the relevant period and who had developed a friendship with Diana during the late 1980s. Unlike the palace official, she had not been part of the institutional machinery, but she had been close enough to observe what was happening and to hear things that were not meant for public consumption. Her perspective offered a different angle on the same events. She described Diana during that period as being under enormous strain, but also as being fiercely protective of certain aspects of her private life. Diana had learned, sometimes through painful experience, that sharing personal information, even with people she considered friends, could lead to that information appearing in newspapers or being used in ways she had not intended. As a result, she had become increasingly careful about what she revealed and to whom. There were parts of her life that she kept compartmentalized, sharing different pieces with different people, so that no one except Diana herself had a complete picture. This woman acknowledged having heard rumors during that time about Diana making private trips abroad for medical reasons that went beyond the explanations offered publicly. She had not asked Diana directly about these trips, understanding that if Diana had wanted to share that information, she would have done so. Looking back, she wondered whether her decision not to ask questions had been a kindness or a failure of friendship. She also expressed regret that the atmosphere of secrecy and caution that surrounded Diana's life had made it difficult for anyone to provide the kind of straightforward support and honest conversation that might have helped her navigate her challenges more effectively. These conversations left William and Harry with a clearer but more painful understanding of the environment their mother had lived in. The picture that emerged was one of a woman caught between her own needs and desires, the expectations of an institution that viewed her primarily in terms of her role and public image, and the constant awareness that almost anything she did or said could become public knowledge. If Diana had been protecting a secret during this period, she would have been doing so under extraordinary pressure and with very limited support. After weeks of examining documents, speaking with former palace officials, and piecing together fragments of their mother's hidden life, William and Harry arrived at a conclusion that both of them found difficult to accept, but impossible to avoid. If the documentation was genuine, if the claims it made were accurate, then somewhere there existed a person whose life had been shaped by the same forces that had affected their own. Someone who had grown up knowing about a connection to Diana, but who had been kept separate from the royal family, living outside the public eye and outside the narrative that the world understood about the Princess of Wales and her legacy. The decision to pursue a meeting with this individual was not made lightly or quickly. Both brothers understood that taking such a step would move the situation into entirely new territory. Up until this point, the investigation had been largely internal, involving documents and conversations with people who were already part of the royal world in one way or another. Meeting the person at the center of these claims would make the situation undeniably real, in a way that examining papers never could. It would also create a relationship, however brief or limited, that could not simply be erased if they later decided they wanted to distance themselves from the entire matter. The practical challenges of arranging such a meeting were considerable. The individual in question had lived a private life, deliberately staying away from public attention and the orbit of the royal family. Making contact required intermediaries who could communicate the brothers' interest without creating a media spectacle or alerting those who might try to exploit the situation for their own purposes. It also required assurances of confidentiality and respect for the privacy that this person had maintained for decades. Eventually, through channels that were kept confidential, even from most of the advisors who had been involved in the broader investigation, arrangements were made. The meeting would take place outside the United Kingdom, in a location that offered neutrality and discretion. No staff would be present beyond those absolutely necessary for security purposes. No records would be kept beyond what the participants themselves chose to remember and perhaps privately document. The meeting would be, as much as possible, a human encounter rather than an institutional event. When William and Harry arrived at the agreed location, they were both dealing with emotions they had not fully anticipated. There was nervousness, certainly, about meeting someone they had never known existed until recently. There was also a strange sense of grief, a renewed awareness of all the years their mother had been gone and all the aspects of her life they would never fully understand. The presence of this other person, if the claims were true, represented a part of Diana's experience that she had chosen to keep separate from them, and that separation carried its own painful implications. The man who entered the room was roughly their contemporary in age, perhaps a few years older than Harry. The physical resemblance to Diana was immediately apparent in certain features: the eyes, the shape of the face, subtle mannerisms that seemed familiar despite this being their first meeting. It was the kind of recognition that cannot be faked or manufactured, the simple fact of shared genetics expressing itself in ways both obvious and subtle. The initial moments of the meeting were awkward, as such moments inevitably are when people are meeting under circumstances that defy normal social protocols. There were no established rules for how princes should greet someone who might be their half-brother, someone whose existence challenged fundamental assumptions about their family, while also representing a human being who had done nothing to create this situation and who had his own complicated feelings about it. When conversation began, it started with basics. The man explained how he had learned about his connection to Diana, a revelation that had come to him through intermediaries when he was still relatively young, but old enough to understand its significance. He described being told that his mother had wanted him to have a life free from the scrutiny and pressure that came with royal connections, that she had made arrangements to ensure he would be cared for while also being protected from the circumstances that had made her own life so difficult. He spoke about receiving occasional messages over the years, communications that came through trusted intermediaries, and that let him know Diana was thinking of him even though they could not have a conventional relationship. These messages had stopped abruptly in 1997, and he had understood what that meant even before seeing the news reports that dominated global media that August. The loss had been strange and complicated for him, grieving for someone he had known existed but had never really known. Someone who had shaped his life through her absence as much as through any direct connection. William listened to all of this with an expression that those who know him would recognize as his careful, evaluative mode. He was processing not just the words being spoken, but their implications, considering how this person's existence and story fit into the larger picture of their family history and what it might mean going forward. He asked questions that were precise and sometimes pointed, seeking to understand the exact nature of the contact this man had had with Diana, who else had known about the situation, and what expectations or assumptions existed about what might happen now. Harry's approach was characteristically more direct and emotional. He wanted to know how this person had felt growing up with knowledge of a connection to Diana, but being unable to acknowledge it publicly. He asked about the man's life, his experiences, whether he had followed the media coverage of Diana, and later of William and Harry themselves. There was a quality to Harry's questions that suggested he was trying to understand this person as an individual, rather than primarily as a complication or a problem to be managed. What emerged from the conversation was a portrait of someone who had built a life that was genuinely his own, separate from royal connections and the public attention that came with them. He had a career, relationships, interests, and commitments that had nothing to do with the circumstances of his birth. He had not spent his life waiting for acknowledgement from the royal family or hoping for some dramatic revelation that would change his status. In fact, he expressed considerable ambivalence about the current situation, uncertainty about whether the emergence of this information would ultimately help or harm him. He explained that he had never sought to make his connection to Diana public and had actively avoided situations where it might come to light. The documentation that had recently surfaced and made its way to William and Harry had not come from him. He suspected it had originated with someone who had been involved in the arrangements Diana made years ago, perhaps someone who felt the truth should be known, or who had their own reasons for wanting to disrupt the status quo. Regardless of the source, he had not asked for this exposure and was not entirely comfortable with where it might lead. This admission created a new dimension to the dilemma facing William and Harry. They had been wrestling with questions about truth, institutional responsibility, and honoring their mother's memory. Now they also had to consider the wishes and well-being of someone who was directly affected by whatever decisions they made. If they chose to verify and acknowledge the connection publicly, they would be altering this man's life in ways he had not chosen and might not want. If they chose to keep the matter private, they would be making a decision about someone else's identity and history without his full consent. William raised the practical concerns that would inevitably arise if the connection were to become public knowledge. Questions of titles, position within the line of succession, financial arrangements, security concerns, and the broader impact on public perception of the monarchy. These were not abstract issues, but real complications that would need to be addressed if they move forward with any form of public acknowledgement. Harry focused more on what he saw as the moral and emotional dimensions. He spoke about Diana's evident wish to protect this person from the pressures of royal life, and whether honouring that wish meant continuing the secrecy, or whether circumstances had changed enough that a different approach might be possible. He also acknowledged the pain of learning about this aspect of their mother's life so long after her death, and the complex feelings that came with meeting someone who represented both a connection to Diana and a reminder of all they had not known about her. The man himself listened to both brothers and then offered his own perspective. He said he understood the impossible position they were in and did not envy them the decisions they had to make. He had no interest in claiming royal status or privileges, but he also did not think he should have to deny his own history or live in permanent secrecy about his origins. What he wanted more than anything was agency over his own story. If there were to be any public acknowledgement, he wanted it to happen in a way that he had some control over, rather than through leaks, tabloid revelations, or institutional announcements made without his input. As the meeting drew toward its conclusion, all three men were acutely aware that nothing had been resolved, but something significant had shifted. William. And Harry now knew this person as an individual rather than as an abstract problem or a line in a document. They had heard his voice, seen his reactions, understood something of how he had navigated the unusual circumstances of his life. Whatever they decided going forward would have to account for his humanity and his right to be part of decisions that affected him so directly. The brothers left the meeting knowing they would need time to process what they had learned and to think carefully about the path forward. They also knew that they were approaching a point where a decision could not be postponed indefinitely. The information was out there, held by enough people that its eventual emergence into public view seemed increasingly likely, whether they controlled that process or not. William felt the weight of responsibility for managing a situation that could have profound implications for the institution he would one day lead. Harry felt the pull of wanting to honour what he saw as their mother's protective instincts, while also recognising that times had changed and that continued secrecy might not serve anyone's interests in the long term. Between them stood a question with no easy answer: how to balance truth and discretion, institutional stability and individual rights, their mother's legacy, and the living reality of a person whose existence challenged comfortable narratives, but who deserved consideration and respect regardless of the complications his presence created.